In the video, you can see as time goes on, he's in a lot of pain. Everyone around him is freaking out, trying to get the beams off him, but the beams are heavy. They're like, hundreds and hundreds of pounds, so they're not moving them by hand. I'm Fred Aranki, I'm a partner at the firm. So this case was an unusual situation where our client was a 24-year-old young man who was working at a steel company out in Suffolk County, Long Island. One of the things that he would do is the client's company would get steel that was fabricated by other companies, and then they would use it to fill orders from clients of theirs that needed steel to build things. So he's working at this company for a few months. The steel had been placed by the fabricator onto the back of a large flatbed truck. Then it was transported from New Jersey to Long Island on this truck. Our client was standing on the side of the truck, and his company was using an overhead crane to pick the steel beams, these long, like 20 feet long steel beams, off of the truck, and then would place them in another area. They would unload these one at a time, and then the truck would leave. While our client was standing on the side of the truck, the beams collapsed onto him and crushed his body basically from like a little bit above the waist down. He suffered terrible injuries, but he's thankfully survived it. He suffered multiple fractures, internal bleeding. He lost most of his large intestine. He had to have multiple surgeries, for all the injuries he suffered to his pelvic area and his legs. It was a very, very traumatic case. It was a situation where if he ate something, he was running to the bathroom within 10 minutes. I mean, imagine being a young man in your 20s and trying to live your life like that, much less any age. You would think that something like that would be a very obvious injury, but there were significant challenges to liability on this case because we had to have a theory of liability. We had to figure out what caused this to happen and whose fault was it. The problem with that for us was that the workers' compensation laws preclude us from suing the employer. So if that held up, then the only claim our client would have would be just a workers' compensation claim and not a personal injury claim. I handled the case with Dan O'Toole, and we became experts on trucking, became experts on how to stack beams, became experts on how to transport steel beams. We had site visits to the warehouse where this occurred to see how they operated and to see how they stacked beams at the warehouse, to see how they were loaded. We did a 3D recreation of the truck with an expert. We prepared this case from day one as if we were going all the way to trial and taking a verdict on it. We hired a steel expert. We hired an expert in graphing and recreating the truck from all different angles, from a 3D angle, to see how the beams were stacked and what would be the best way to stack them. It spared no expense to get this case ready to argue at trial. One of the main arguments that we made was that the way that the beams were stacked, they weren't stacked properly in a way that would avoid them from tipping over, and they weren't properly banded so that it would make them more stable. These beams weren't just going on a 5-minute drive, they were going on over an hour-long drive from New Jersey to Long Island. And so one of the arguments was that you had to make sure that they were stable to drive that far. The other argument that we made was that there are these stanchions that can get placed into the side of a truck. They're just basically big metal bars that just slide into these holes. They get locked in on the bottom so that if the beams fell, they would be stopped or at least slowed by the stanchions, allowing our client to either not get hit or at least get out of the way. They defended this case very, very vigorously because they just basically said, look, we did everything that we were supposed to do. We didn't do anything wrong. We didn't violate any regulations. This was the industry standard as to how you stacked and transported beams. They were blaming the entire accident on the plaintiff's employer. They also were partially blaming our client for standing where he was standing. One of the things we learned was that there's something called the shadow zone, which is worst case scenario. If the load falls off the back of the truck, there's a zone where it's going to land. And they were saying that our client was partially at fault because he was standing within that zone. And another defense that they had made was they actually did a recreation of this accident in the warehouse. They put the stanchions in, knocked the beams down, and the beams went right through the stanchions as if they were like paper. Our argument against that was that anytime you're doing any kind of recreation, it's really hard to get that into trial because it can be so prejudicial. You're not going to recreate the same exact conditions that existed at the time of the accident. There were a lot of different arguments we were going to make in rebuttal to that. We just kept hitting them with argument after argument after argument, like this is what we're going to prove. We focused on all the different theories that we had against them and how our theories of liability were going to get into evidence. Dan was amazing on this case. I mean, he's the best person I've ever seen at thinking outside the box. So when someone gets injured in an accident on the job, they're entitled to workers' compensation benefits. And workers' compensation benefits consist of medical benefits as well as what they call indemnity benefits or lost wages. Workers' comp doesn't pay full lost wages. They determine how much your pay was, and then they basically cut it by at least half to 2/3, and then that's what you get. Our client's employer was a very stand-up guy, and he, for most of the time the lawsuit was going on, he paid our client his full paycheck every week. Not only did he pay what the workers' comp would have paid, he paid him his full actual paycheck every week. To say it's unusual is an understatement. In all the years I've been doing this, I think I saw maybe one other employer do that, and they didn't do it for the whole time. They just did it for a period of months maybe. When we took his deposition and he was asked about this, and he just said, it was the right thing to do. He didn't even think twice about it. He just did it. It makes you feel like there are really good people in the world when you see somebody do something like that they didn't have to do but just did it because they wanted to. The case settled for $7 million. I don't think I've ever met a client who was so positive about his situation and such a positive outlook. He made a much better recovery than anybody imagined he would. He's gone back to lifeguarding. He's gone back to off-roading. He's really being careful with the money. He's just the kind of guy who's not going to let this get him down forever. It was one of the cases that scared me the most out of all the cases I had because it was such high stakes and because we really wanted a good result for him and because we knew it was a case that we could easily lose. But sometimes those are the best ones when they're done.